Welcome back to the channel and part two of my review of The Iron Cage, the story of the Palestinian struggle for statehood by Professor Rashid Khalidi. If you haven't seen part one of this video, you don't have to because I've divided it chronologically into pre-1948 and post-1948. This is part two, which is the post-1948. So if you want to keep watching, and then you can see the part one after this, which talks about how we got to 1948. As a review, Professor Khalidi wrote this book to talk about the fact that the Palestinians did have agency at different times in their history. They haven't always only been victims, and he thinks that's important for this dialogue, and I believe that as well, even more so after reading this really wonderful book. So I left off in part one talking about the civil war that erupted in Palestine after the United Nations declaration of partition, but we get to Israel unilaterally declaring independence on May the 15th, 1948. So they declare independence. And obviously the legends at that time, which are repeated by numerous people in the comment section, just talking points from people who've never seemed to read any books on the issue. Their leaders told them to leave, or we were invaded by 6 Arab armies. Firstly, this isn't even factually correct. The Jordanians colluded with the British and the Israelis. The Hashemites effectively through at the time Amir Abdullah would later become King Abdullah. He wanted part of the land, and he considered himself, let's say, the father of the Palestinians. The Palestinians didn't elect him for that. He just chose that, and as a result, his armies, which were the Arab Legion, they were the most well trained of any of the armies. They didn't invade Israel. They were also in charge of the Iraqis. They didn't invade Israel either. The only 2 armies that really invaded Israel, let's say to a significant effect, are the Egyptians and the Syrians. But the idea that the Egyptians and the Syrians, who had their own reasons for interfering, are then speaking for the Palestinian people is a crazy idea. It's an absolutely crazy idea. And this is something that is repeated all the time. All these armies came and invaded us, and as a result, they were going to try to drive us into the sea. And Professor Khalidi comments, another basis for denying Israeli responsibility for the flight of the refugees is the claim that the Palestinians attacked the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, before 1948. First, and that the flight of the refugees was simply a byproduct of a war that the Arabs had started and lost. This argument simplistically and falsely reads a desperate and unequal communal conflict between 2 peoples until the end of the mandate on May the 15th, 1948 as Arab aggression. It's not aggression to disagree with people you live in a land with. Israel didn't exist prior to May 15th, 1948. So the idea that there was Arab aggression, they were imposing themselves on a majority population. Let's just do the numbers. Prior to 1948, you have 1.4 of the 2 million people that lived in the area were Arabs. And let's say Palestinians to be more specific. 1.4 of the 2 million Palestinians, 90% of the private land owned in the area was owned by Arabs. So this idea that it was Arab aggression, it's simply unfair. It doesn't really look at the situation on the ground. This argument furthermore ignores the fact that in many cases, Palestinians were driven out of areas where there was no fighting, where there were local truces, or where fighting had long ended, and that the vast majority were not allowed to return to their homes even after the fighting was over. Most importantly, it ignores a basic fact, which had been clear to those with any sense on both sides since the beginning of the conflict a few decades earlier. This was that if a state with a Jewish majority controlling the bulk of the land was to be created in Palestine, a country with a massive Arab majority with uncontested legal claim to the lion's share of privately owned land, the expulsion of a large part of this majority and the seizure of their land was absolutely necessary. This fact was the basis of the extraordinary discussions among mainstream Zionist leaders in the 1920s and 1930s, always in private, so as not to reveal to unfriendly ears the true intentions of the movement, concerning the so-called transfer of the Arab population outside the frontiers of mandatory Palestine, meaning their removal from the country. This was a fantastic concept at best and a sinister one at worst, since it was manifestly clear to all concerned that the Palestinians had no intention of allowing themselves to be transferred out of their own country, and that if they were made to leave, massive force would be required. And as I said, this thought, the 1920s and 1930s thought, I talked about in my ethnic cleansing in Palestine was said by Yishai Fleischer in Hebron to me earlier this year, in which he said that the Arabs can just leave. This has been the intention and the idea of the Zionists in the 1920s and 1930s, and in the 2020s and 2030s potentially as well. That the Zionists always have this idea that they can leave. The very term transfer, still occasionally used in Israeli public discourse, is an Orwellian euphemism for the violent removal of a people from a country in order to create new demographic and therefore national realities. It is what today would be called ethnic cleansing, but that is a term that is rarely applied to what happened in 1948. Most parties to the discussion inside Israel favoring the term transfer or some other sanitized and neutral designation. So people in the comments were telling me, oh, you've got to read Benny Morris. Benny Morris says 600,000 to 760,000 Palestinians were cleansed out of this area. So if you don't accept the number 760, which is at the high end of what Benny Morris says, okay, it's 600,000, right? That's the low end of what Benny Morris. So 600,000 people were driven out of their homes. And the idea was, well, because there were some invasions by the Egyptian army and the Syrian army, therefore you lose your house. That makes no sense to anybody. And the idea that 6 Arab armies attacked us and they were going to drive us into the sea, this is all nuts. The Zionists were extremely well prepared. They outnumbered the Palestinians by 5-1. I think the army of the Israelis, the Zionists, were 50,000. I think well armed, well trained, had been trained also by the British using British weapons. And the Palestinians, as we had already talked about in the previous video, were leaderless. They didn't have national cohesiveness. Even though they had an identity as a people, they didn't have a form of government or a national assembly, and they were roundly defeated. Big surprise. The Arab states around, if we continue on this narrative past 1948 into the time of the PLO, Fatah, and the PA, we have to give credit to them that the PLO were able to once again bring a focus of the world to the Palestinian people and their plight. But we have to take that small good with the lots of bad, which is that Arafat was not a Mandela character. He allowed a lot of corruption and cronyism in the PLO. When I was talking to a Palestinian earlier this year, he told me with chagrin, he said, "Do you know there's a Palestinian Navy? Palestinian Air Force?" And he was saying it to me, with this smile. But of course, there's not a Palestinian Navy, there's not a Palestinian Air Force, but the PA uses international aid money and has 400 basically crony jobs for people who are well placed to work in the Palestinian Navy. There's no Palestinian Navy, but they just basically have titles and jobs. So there's corruption in the PA and the PLO to this present day. The Palestinians have to take responsibility for that. They don't have a squeaky clean organization. Worse, they seem not to have learned the lessons from before 1948, in which the Palestinians did not have a cohesive national body, which could then say, this is what's going on. And this has only become worse over time when the Palestinian Authority returned to the West Bank, and you started to see this drift away with Gaza. And this level of corruption means that the Palestinians could not prepare for an eventual state. That's the whole idea. You have to prepare to become a country. You can't just become a country overnight. You have to have the proper government functionaries in place. You have to have a rule of law. You have to have judges. You have to have policemen. You have to have a housing authority. You potentially have to have hospitals, schools, etc. And that is now that being administered in many places, particularly in Gaza, it's being administered by Hamas. Now, what's interesting and fascinating about the Hamas takeover is that it was taken over here. I'm just going to read Professor Khalidi's words. Palestine, not a state, not sovereign, and under occupation, has thus been one of the first Arab countries, with the exception of Lebanon, to witness a democratic change of government in the wake of the January 2006 elections. Hamas ran in a democratic election and they won. If people are opposed to democracy, I suppose they could say something, but if you're for democracy, you have to look and say, why did the Palestinians in Gaza elect Hamas? Because they were sick of what Fatah and the PA was offering. And I had a chance to visit the West Bank. I didn't get down into Gaza. I was in and around Gaza. I got to speak to some Palestinians at the Erez crossing and to some Israelis nearby, actually in some of the areas that were attacked on October the 7th. but I couldn't get into Gaza. Not only the US State Department wouldn't really give me any help in this area, but I found out you actually need three people to approve you to get in to Gaza. You need the PA to approve you, Hamas, and the Israelis. And that process is slow walked and takes months and months and months. And I had no help. I wanted to go in to Gaza to try to figure out what was going on there for myself to see it, but it's almost impossible to visit. Um, and and people want to look around at the other Arab states. This is something else we have to realize. The PLO did itself no favors by getting involved in political disputes in Lebanon and Jordan and other places, and then getting themselves kicked out, that they needed to stay focused on Palestine as the issue. That was what people were going to focus on, this noble cause, and instead they got involved in some other politics. They have to take responsibility for that as well. Okay, just some closing thoughts. However, some would say that the revival in the salience of the Palestinians was mainly the result of the cohesiveness, persistence, and perseverance of Palestinian society and the Palestinian people, their steadfastness, and their stubborn refusal to cease to exist in the face of the extraordinary pressures on them to disappear. That despite everyone wanting this problem to go away, it will not go away. The Palestinians would ideally do Israel a favor by forgetting their lost homes and property, their homeland, and what has been done to them, and simply melting into the surrounding Arab countries, where many of them now resided as exiles. This idea, again, that because you are a people, you deserve a land. I talked about this in my Ethnic Cleansing a Palestine video, that the Kurds don't have a homeland. The Basques don't have a homeland. The Catalans, you could argue, don't have a homeland. Just because you are a people doesn't mean you are entitled to a homeland. There may be a moral case to be made for it, but you still have to figure out how that's going to happen. You can't just take a homeland, which this is what the Zionists did. But normally speaking, you can't just take a homeland. You have to figure it out with the people who live there. The people who live there say, okay, fine, you want to have a little area here. And Khalidi points this out in the book. Could there have been a time when the Palestinian leadership could have said, okay, some Jews want to live here, let's create a state and let's make it work? We'll never know now. It's a counterfactual. But the idea that the Jews are just entitled to this, they're entitled to have our own land because they're Jewish, is a crazy idea. And people have to see it for crazy as it is. Being Jewish is not, it's a religion, right? It's a religion that happens to be an ethnicity as well for some people. But a lot of the Jews that came in with the Zionist settlers were Europeans. They were not from the area. There's more that I could talk about, but I think I should probably just end it there. If you liked this, and just the last thing I would say is the notes, the end notes for this. I think I bought a half dozen books, and I added another 12 to the wish list just from the bibliography here. This is an absolute treasure. I can't wait to read more of Professor Khalidi. Just excellent writing. Can be dry at some times because he is an academic. So it's not this, tight narrative, but it's fascinating for those who are interested in this and want to know more and want to educate themselves about what happened prior so that you can understand what is happening now. If you like this video, hit like, hit subscribe. Please share this with your friends, family you think might be interested in learning more about this. If you'd like to support the work even more, you can buy items from my wish list. You can become a member on YouTube, or you can become a member on Patreon. And as I said, I'll be continuing to do one review per month in all of 2024 covering Israel and Palestine. I'll be covering all sorts of different authors on this. And I can't wait to share this with you, learn from you. I've been learning so much in the comment section. Thank you. Keep the book recommendations coming. And until next time, enjoy your reading.